The name Jupiter conjures up various images: the fifth planet from the sun, the most rousing part of Holt's planet suite, and the chief of the Roman gods. And he's a bit like Zeus, except in one major way. Jupiter was not only the god of the Romans, but also the Roman state and its empire. Thomas Apel suggested it was the blessings of this god that helped Rome's success. So in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore, we're going to find out a little bit more about Jupiter. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I hope that you're doing well and that you're enjoying May. And we are going to continue with the Roman gods in Britain theme that we've been doing this month. I do also want to say before I forget that next month we're going to be doing a bit of a strange miscellany kind of thing. So we're going to be doing slightly less connected episodes, but that all come under the heading of like really bizarre things. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is the folklore of strange place names. So that is what is coming in June. So I hope you enjoy that. But we are continuing, as I say, with the Roman gods of Britain, or rather the gods in Roman Britain, as I should say. So we've done Neptune, we've done Oceanus, we've done Mithras, we've done Mars, and this week we're going to do Jupiter, and it's kind of a bit of a long time coming because he is the king of the gods. Now, as I said in the introduction, he is usually likened to Zeus of Greek mythology in quite a lot of ways, and because in many ways also Jupiter is the god of the sky, thunder and storms. He does wield the lightning bolt as his weapon, and he is often shown on a throne holding a staff and scepter. He's often linked with the oak tree, like Zeus, and some have actually suggested this is because the tree is actually prone to lightning strikes, and like Zeus, Jupiter's sacred bird was the eagle. But like I say, there is a little bit of a difference between Zeus and Jupiter because of the fact that Jupiter is very much tied to the Roman state in a way that Zeus kind of wasn't to the Greek state. And we did see last week how the worship of Mars did actually adapt to suit the changing nature of the Roman state, and its transition from a city-state to an empire meant that Mars's role had to evolve along with it. And essentially the same thing happened to Jupiter as the Republic fell and the empire rose. And ultimately what happened was the cults that worshipped deified emperors basically surpassed Jupiter's worship, and the days of Jupiter were pretty much well over by the conversion to Christianity in the 4th century CE. But there is still quite a lot that we can dig into for this quite interesting and actually quite complex figure, so that is what we're going to do in this week's episode. So as I've mentioned in a couple of the episodes so far, there was once something called the Archaic Triad, which was Jupiter, Mars and Quirinus, and they essentially ruled as like the trio of top gods. But then after that, they were replaced by the Capitoline Triad, which was Jupiter, Juno and Minerva. So it's quite interesting that Jupiter is the only common figure to both triads. And unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because we kind of see a very similar thing today, but never mind, the Roman military machine basically used Jupiter to justify their expansionist aims because they believed that Jupiter had chosen them to rule the world. So therefore it was part of their mission, as it were, to then go out and conquer as much of the world as they could find. That being said, Jupiter is often still seen as being quite impartial, concerned more with justice and the law. He did actually only become Jupiter with a J in the Middle Ages when J became part of the Latin alphabet, because in ancient Latin it didn't have a J, so it was actually called Iupiter. And his name came from Diu, which is a Proto-Indo-European word that means sky or day, and the Greek or Latin word pater meaning father. So essentially you do translate Jupiter to sky father. Now, Jupiter does, in most sources, share a somewhat similar origin story to the Greek god Zeus, and in it, Saturn was the original sky god, and he and Ops, an earth goddess, had 6 children, and these were Jupiter, Neptune, Pluto, Ceres, Vesta, and Juno. Saturn had overthrown his father Caelus to assume control of the heavens, and he then learned that one of his own children would likewise overthrow him. So he swallowed the first 5 children. Ops obviously started to get a little bit annoyed with this, and then she actually hid the baby Jupiter when he was born. She gave Saturn a rock in swaddling clothes instead, which he duly swallowed. Clearly couldn't digest it, so eventually he vomited the rock up along with the children, and then they and Jupiter overthrew Saturn, and Jupiter assumed control of the heavens. Interestingly, I did find this one of the sources. The Greek story saw Kronos cast out for the fact that he had then been deposed, but the Romans did actually continue to have some level of worship for Saturn even after Jupiter took his throne, so you do get a little bit of a difference there. Now, in many ways, Jupiter and his wife Juno, who, yes, is his sister, parallel Zeus and Hera, and like Zeus, Jupiter was incredibly unfaithful to Juno, and his children from his extramarital affairs include Mercury, Proserpina, and Minerva. There are many more, but they're just the main ones, and we're not going to delve into the myths because I don't necessarily think that it's that instructive, because you can basically take a lot of the tales of Zeus from the zodiac origin myths that we did, and you can just swap Zeus out for Jupiter. I should point out that one of the sources I was reading did actually note that you get quite a lot of stories about Zeus as a baby and a child in the Greek mythology, but you don't get that many about Jupiter because his origins in some ways, yes, they've been mapped onto Zeus, but there is some debate that he may have actually existed in a different form before that. But again, don't really want to dwell on that because it's more important what happens when Rome get their hands on him. There is one myth that I want to touch on just because I do think it is quite an interesting one, and it's Jupiter and the Great Flood. And again, you can find this with Jupiter named as Zeus as well. And essentially, Ovid wrote this story in around about 8 CE. And in the story, Jupiter learns of humanity's evil activities, and he decides to find out what's actually going on among humans. So he visits King Lycaon, and he's welcomed by the local people, but Lycaon doesn't quite trust this person who's turned up claiming to be Jupiter. So he decides to test whether he's a god or a regular man. So one of his tactics is to plot to murder Jupiter in his sleep to see if he really is immortal, and his other test is to serve the god a roasted prisoner for dinner to see if he is actually all-knowing. Jupiter does not look kindly on Lycaon's attempts to murder him or feed him a roasted prisoner, and he does then see Lycaon as a representative of humanity. So if Lycaon is so evil, Jupiter reasons, then so must the rest of humanity be. So he first destroys Lycaon's house with a thunderbolt and then turns Lycaon into a wolf, and there is obviously some debate that this is where the word lycanthropy comes from. Next, Jupiter unleashes a torrential flood from the sea and sky. In some versions of the story, he actually gets Neptune to help. But Jupiter essentially wants to wipe out humanity, except for Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha. Now, they represent the ideal couple, and Jupiter decides to let them live. So he basically, once he realises he's wiped out all of the life on Earth, he calms the waters so that Deucalion and Pyrrha can then reach Mount Parnassus. Once there, they seek the counsel of Themis, the goddess of justice, and she gives them a little bit of advice about what they need to do. They end up throwing stones over their shoulders, which are called the bones of Gaia, and then these turn into humans, and thus humanity is reborn. So it's quite interesting that there are so many cultures who have this myth about a great flood that destroys all but 2 humans, and that's why I wanted to include it. Now, unlike Zeus, as I've said, Jupiter's myths are less concerned with this grand narrative because of the fact that he's so strongly tied to the relationship with Rome. And Numa Pompilius, who was Rome's second king, was the one who essentially brought him into the Roman pantheon. And according to the legend, Numa managed to summon Jupiter with the help of 2 of the lesser gods and explained that he was facing various issues as king. So Jupiter says, fair enough, I'll help you out, but these are the sacrifices that I want in return. And then Numa says, no problem, I also want to learn how to avoid lightning bolts. So they essentially shake on the deal. Jupiter gets the worship that he wants, and the Romans get his protection. The Romans then built their finest temple to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, and they called it the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. And Jupiter Optimus Maximus means Jupiter greatest and best, which is probably my favourite Roman god name ever. Another name from at this temple was Jupiter Capitolinus, which is basically just Jupiter of the Capitoline Hill. Now, apparently this temple was so magnificent that it actually had a statue of Jupiter and a 4-horse chariot on the temple's apex, so it was clearly quite grand. And it basically just went to show how important Jupiter was to the Roman people. The Romans would sacrifice oxen and lambs there every year on the Ides of March, and then they would sacrifice goats there on the Ides of January. Now, Jupiter's links with the eagle that I mentioned earlier did mean that the Romans essentially understood his will through the practice of augury. And we have briefly touched on this before, ages ago when we did divination. But people call augurs watched birds to read omens in their flight patterns. And this is where we get the word auspicious from, because this was read as taking the auspices. So essentially the flight patterns of eagles were supposed to give the most revealing prophecies because they were so intrinsically linked with Jupiter. So people believed that they could read what Jupiter wanted through how the eagles flew, which could also explain some of Jupiter's links with prophecy, although Virgil does have him issuing prophecies in the Aeneid. But the interesting thing about Jupiter is because he's been so much tied into how Rome functions as a state and so on, foreign ambassadors would actually ask for permission to make sacrifices to Jupiter at his Capitoline temple. They would also leave offerings, and smaller states did so after Rome had conquered them, and also they would do it if they wanted to seek alliances with Rome. And this all went to strengthen the sense of Jupiter as the supreme god. Now, Rome's allies essentially were acknowledging his level of power through making these sacrifices to him at his temple. The Romans did frame the sacrifice as being voluntary, which did let the smaller states save face because they were offering to do it of their own volition, but it did also cement Jupiter's status as the god of international relations, because it would explain why ambassadors would leave copies of agreements and treaties in the temple. Because ultimately there wasn't anyone to oversee whether anyone actually kept to their side of the bargain, so it essentially turned Jupiter into this supreme witness because he would oversee these agreements, so neither side could break them without provoking Jupiter's wrath. People would also seek Jupiter's patronage to legitimize their power, and Cale Davenport actually gives the example of Diocletian and Maximian, and both of these were soldier emperors having risen through the ranks, but like senatorial emperors, they essentially wanted to align themselves with the gods to again help legitimize their rule. But they both went one step better, because they actually adopted the signa Jovius and Hercules, respectively, which basically meant, we have this divine descent from Jupiter and Hercules. The names weren't actually official, but they did appear on some inscriptions. So people were essentially invoking Jupiter as the protector or defender of the emperor, and then this would then become a way of promising protection for the empire via Rome's patronage by the gods. Obviously, there were various different ways of honouring Jupiter, and the Romans held the Ludi Romani, or Roman Games, in September in Jupiter's honour. They would also hold processions called triumphs whenever they had a military success, and basically what happened here is the victorious general would lead his procession through the streets, which gave him the chance to show off his army and any spoils, basically anything that they'd plundered along the way. The procession would end at the temple, where they would offer sacrifices and some of what they'd taken as thanks for Jupiter's help in the matter. Now, sacrifices were a major part of the worship of Roman gods, and actually they were necessary to persuade the gods to do anything for you. And as Martin Hennig says in his excellent book about religion in Roman Britain, if a god accepted a sacrifice, he could be trusted to keep his side of the bargain. Now, worshippers basically had to give prayers written in a very precise formula, and these had to be correct or they might fail, to the extent that if a priest made a mistake, he might go back to the beginning of the prayer or even the entire service and start again. It was also essential to use the god's correct name or they just simply wouldn't respond. So to try and avoid this, and I love this, people might say to Jupiter or whatever name you wish to be called, which obviously kind of circumvents some of the issues with getting the name right. The devotee would promise to create an altar and sacrifice an animal if they got what they wanted. And ultimately, if the god didn't help, then they didn't need to do that, which I think is quite cool. Now, the focus in much of the scholarship is actually on sacrificing animals, which obviously in this day and age we kind of look down on quite a lot. But people would also sacrifice, and I'm saying that in inverted commas, grain, silver plate, fruit or clay figures because they considered these things valuable. So it's essentially that idea of giving up something that is valuable to you. They would use blood because it did symbolise life. But this was something that was quite interesting that Hennig points out, the fact that you go, sacrificing an animal, what a waste. Not really, because basically what they did was they actually gave the inedible parts of the animal to the gods, and then they would use the rest of the meat for a feast, or butchers would then sell it on. So it was actually just a means of consuming an animal by the population. So clearly the Romans obviously were going to bring their supreme deity with them when they invaded Britain, because after all, the Capitoline Triad also looked after the security and health of the Roman state, because they weren't just personal gods as the Greek ones were. So experts found many altars dedicated to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, and I'm never going to get tired of saying that, at Maryport in Cumbria. And this was basically due to something called the annual January sacrifice. So every January, on the 3rd, which was Jupiter's birthday, worshippers would ask Jupiter to protect the state in the coming year, and then they would bury the previous year's altar and start with this new one. Incidentally, soldiers might also bury altars if they were going to abandon the fort or hand it over to a different unit, because as Hennig explains, burying something in the ground was basically the established way of disposing of or storing objects that had been charged with divine power. Now, to show how far this dedication to Jupiter Optimus Maximus actually went, a Roman officer in Dorchester actually set up a small shrine to him, and this wasn't even an official army location, but it just showed the level of dedication to the highest of the Roman gods. And you could always spot a Jupiter Optimus Maximus altar because they've got their IOM inscription on them. And obviously you have to remember as well the fact that the Romans would be far from home at this point, so obviously taking their worship of Jupiter with them was also, while yes it was showing fealty to Rome and the Roman state, it was also essentially taking a piece of home with them as well. Now experts sometimes find something called a solar wheel, which as you might imagine essentially looks like a wheel, on Jupiter's alts at forts along Hadrian's Wall. And this is quite an interesting thing because it's something that you find in the Gallo-Roman traditions, because they held the wheel symbol as sacred because it represented Jupiter Taranis, and here Jupiter is twinned with the Celtic sky god Taranis. And the wheel essentially to them represented the solar force. Yet it was also kind of acceptable to the Romans because they saw the wheel as being part of Jupiter's chariot, which would roll thunder across the sky. So pretty much like Mars, Jupiter could represent what his worshippers needed, and in so doing would also demonstrate their fealty to Rome as well. Because you've got to remember, this is the interesting thing with Jupiter. You're not just simply offering thanks to Jupiter, you are also showing your dedication to Rome at the same time. They also found a Jupiter column in Chichester, which showed a slightly different divine triad from the ones that we normally see. So on 3 sides of the base, you have Mars, Minerva and 2 nymphs. And then on the other side, which is the bit at the front, you have Jupiter Optimus Maximus. And this column would stand in the Great Square, which was the equivalent of the Roman Forum. And Hennig notes it's unclear as to whether Chichester had a specific Jupiter temple, but it is fairly obvious why these 3 deities would have been chosen, because all 3 have links with military success and also the might of Rome. Miranda Aldhouse Green also notes the Jupiter Giant column, as it's called, in Cirencester, which was dedicated by a citizen of Rheims, and this depicts the god on horseback with its hooves trampling a giant. Now, the Roman Jupiter was never shown mounted, so this depiction shows the influence of Gallic traditions, which would explain why, because it was dedicated by someone from Rheims. And Jupiter is noted for his links to the Roman state, but this one borrows from the iconography of other powerful gods. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of a way of showing homage to lots of different versions of the god at the same time. And at this point, it's enter Jupiter Dolichenus, because it does get a little bit confusing when you research Jupiter in Roman Britain, because you do come across Jupiter Dolichenus. And he was actually the god of a Roman mystery cult that was based on Dolicha, who is referred to as both a Hittite and Assyrian thunder god from southeastern Turkey. Now, according to most sources, worshippers carried the cult to Rome and then onwards to its military outposts. But much like the cult of Mithras, it was a mystery religion, so it is a little bit difficult to find out much about Jupiter Dolichenus. He was believed to oversee military success, and he wielded both the double axe and the thunderbolt. And as Hennig explains, visions were very often associated with the god Jupiter Dolichenus, who was prone to admonish his votaries or bring them visions and dreams. And this is quite interesting because this side of Jupiter Dolichenus sort of links with Jupiter's general association with prophecies as well. Now, excavations at the Vindolanda fort near Hadrian's Wall actually uncovered altars to Jupiter Dolichenus in 2009, and archaeologists found them in a shrine beside the fort's north gate. The largest shows Jupiter Dolichenus standing on the back of a bull holding his weapons. And again, this is where you can tell it's Jupiter Dolichenus because of the link with the bull. And it was a prefect of the 4th cohort of Gauls who actually erected the altar, so you can only assume that whatever it was he asked for, he must have apparently gotten. Now, temples to Jupiter Dolichenus often lay outside the walls of the fort, and there are some scholars who've discussed the division between official and non-official army cults, a little bit like you often find the Mithraea outside of the bounds of the fort, kind of beyond almost where they were supposed to be. But Hennig thinks it wasn't actually that rigid in practice, because all of the cults would have seen some degree of worship, whether they were part of the official religion or not. And as Aldhouse Green points out, Rome actually boasted a Dolicene sanctuary on the Avetine Hill, so it does just go to show how mainstream his cult had become by the 3rd century CE. But as we come to the end of this, we can see that the biggest thing about Jupiter is he has had such a link to the Roman state, as well as just simply his own functionality as well, which does make him a slightly different god from some of the other ones that we've looked at so far. And it's quite easy to dismiss him as a god, since so many of his myths do involve his mistreatment either of women or his wife. And other Roman figures do persist in popular culture, because we have Fortuna, who hides in our conversations disguised as Lady Luck. We've got Pluto and Proserpina, or Hades and Persephone depending on the depiction, who have become an unlikely poster couple for #relationship goals. And even Asclepius, one of my absolute favourites, lives on because his snake-twined rod is a recognisable symbol for medicine. And look at Apollo, he lent his name to a space programme. But not so for Jupiter. The thunder god most of us think of is probably more likely to be Thor, not the Roman chief god. So could it be that we find little use for him now? Having been shackled to the rise and fall of a single state, does Jupiter struggle to find a place for us now? Because it could entirely be difficult to reconcile his status as a god of justice and the law with the tales of his infidelity. But I think that we should actually find a flicker of value in his role in overseeing agreements, because in an age where many leaders, politicians, company owners, CEOs, the lot, go back on their word with merry abandon, perhaps this is where Jupiter could rediscover himself. And also remember, he's the bringer of jollity, and we could certainly do with some of that. So I hope you enjoyed that whistle-stop tour of Jupiter. Clearly he could have an entire series all on his own, but as I say, these episodes are kind of designed as sort of a short immersion in a topic. I do hope that you do go off to research things beyond what I've given you. I do have, obviously, the list of the references and so on are at the bottom of the blog posts that go with these podcast episodes, and you can always find the link to that blog post in the show notes. So if any of this has tickled your fancy, the 2 books I would recommend are the Miranda Aldhouse Green book and the Martin Hennig one. They're both very good, and they're both very affordable as well on Amazon. We are going to go and meet a local god to me who was a Celtic god adopted kind of by the Romans but not actually Romanized, which is quite an interesting thing to have happen. So we are going to go and meet Antonicus next week, and as I say, the week after that we'll be going on to the month of all things strange and miscellaneous. So I do have a slot in that for another topic, so if you do have any requests, please use the requests form that I've got linked below, and then you can just ask for anything that you fancy. I have, of course, waffled on longer than I normally would, just because there's so much to say about Jupiter. And interestingly, it is actually Thursday that I'm recording this, and Thursday is obviously Jupiter's day as well. So happy Jupiter Day to him. Or should I say by Jove, because that is where Jove comes from. It is actually Jupiter. Probably should have mentioned that earlier in the episode. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you go and find out a little bit more about Jupiter, because I do think we could do with a bit of his overseeing of agreements and all that kind of jazz. I do think you could be quite useful in that respect. But anyway, I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you next week when we round out May with the delight that is Antonicus. So I will see you then. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.